Alright, so this is just going to be a brief review of the study guide for Exam 2. If you have any questions about the material, please feel free to let me know. So Exam 2 is going to have the same format as Exam 1, so it'll be released on Canvas. It'll be open for a week. You can take it at any point during that week, but once you start it, you need to be prepared to finish it in one session. You'll have 75 minutes to take it. It'll be multiple choice, true, false, and matching, and remember that you do have those two opinion questions. So the last two multiple choice questions will look different from the other questions. They'll ask your opinions on something. Now, the way that works is that after the exam closes, I will go in and make sure that everyone received extra credit for it. Basically, they're set up like other multiple choice questions, which means I have to choose one of the answers as the right answer. If you pick whichever one I chose as the right answer, then you'll get those points initially. If you pick another answer, you won't get the points initially, but when I go back in and mark it as full credit for everyone, then you'll get those points. So your grade may go up a little bit. I realize that's kind of a roundabout way of doing that, but it's the only way that Canvas will let me give you guys full credit for a couple of questions there. Alright, so Exam 2 is going to cover Jung, Erickson, Maslow, and Rogers. So we talked about Jung here, and we talked about how he was very much influenced by the occult, and that he had had kind of a difficult childhood, as many of our therapists have and our theorists have. So he had these levels of psyche that in a way sounded similar to Freud, but kind of expanded, maybe went beyond Freud. So he would say that you have the parts of your personality that are in conscious awareness, and then you also have some that are in your personal unconscious, so that your own personally repressed or denied experiences and thoughts and feelings and memories. But then he would also say that you have a collective unconscious. The idea that the human experience has been kind of collected and passed down to us, and that this causes our instincts, basically, because of experiences that our ancestors have. And so Jung mentioned how he believed that the contents of that collective unconscious were our archetypes. So we talked about several different types of archetypes, so just kind of review over those. Basically, those archetypes are themes that we have seen throughout history that we continue to see in ourselves. And so we talked about how this is kind of part of being human, that we use these characters, and we see these characters in books and in movies, and we can relate to them because we see them in everyday life, and that maybe this is what being human has always been like. And so maybe we now have these experiences that have been passed on to us from our ancestors that impact us today, even if we're not aware of it. So Jung was involved, and his theory was involved in a personality type testing. It was the Myers-Briggs type indicator. I don't know that you need to know that, but that was the type of test that came from his theory. So Jung suggested that we have personality types that are made up of, first, your attitude, which is either going to be primarily extroverted or primarily introverted, and then one of these functions, whichever one of these functions that you lean towards more. And so then you could be extroverted thinking, extroverted feeling, extroverted sensing or sensation, and extroverted intuition or intuiting, and then introverted thinking, introverted feeling, introverted sensing, or introverted intuiting. So then there are 8 possible types here. So the idea is that everyone has some of each of these. It's just that you lean more towards one than the other. So Jung would say that everyone has some extroversion in them and some introversion in them, but that we tend to lean more towards one or the other. And that in his stages of development, he suggested that as we get older, the way that we view ourselves and the world changes a little bit. And so when we're younger, he would say typically we're more extroverted, and you can see this in children. A lot of children are very outgoing and friendly, and then as they get older, they become more mature, and they have to try to find a way to separate themselves from childhood. And Jung would say that as we get older, we become more introverted as we kind of prepare for death. And remember that Jung's concept here is that death is not necessarily a negative thing. He's describe death as the goal of life, kind of. That's where we're all heading there. Good. So Jung, like many of the theorists in the second section of the course, had a concept for this kind of ideal psychological functioning, which of course all of our theorists are going to agree that not everyone reaches. So take a look at that. Erikson was related to Freud's theory. He expanded upon it. So Freud's theory mostly talked about different stages in childhood, and then if you look at his theory, it kind of suggested that once we go into puberty, we're pretty much the same throughout the rest of our lives, although there was the possibility of some maturity later in life. But Erikson had these stages that went throughout the lifespan, so he expanded on that. He did include some of Freud's thinking, so you'll see some of the stages sound the same. So there'll be mentions of that, oral and anal and genital and that kind of thing that will sound similar to Freud, but he was less focused on sex, less focused on aggression. It was basically the idea that at every stage of life we have a conflict. Conflict's not necessarily a bad thing. It's something that we have to face. And if we are able to overcome that conflict, we gain strength from that. If we're not able to overcome that conflict, then we don't have strength. And Erikson would say that the problem with that is that if you have not gained strength from overcoming previous conflicts, you may not be able to overcome future conflicts either. So remember that Erikson focused on the ego, not so much on the id that Freud would focus on. And he had this theory that our ego is very much so impacted by our society, by our relationships. So he had this epigenetic principle, which basically says, okay, your personality develops in stages that are related to your physiological development. And that makes sense. You cannot be born with your personality already in place if the parts of your brain that house your personality are not fully developed yet. So it makes sense that as we get older and as our cognitive abilities grow with our physiological development, then our personality grows. So then it is nature in that everyone has, based on their development, a similar conflict at a similar time based on their genetics or their development. But the idea is whether you're able to successfully overcome that conflict is primarily nurture. It's primarily from your relationships, from society, from support that you received, right? So it's a combination of nature-nurture. Maslow had his hierarchy of needs. So he said that basically everyone everywhere has the same motivations, that we are always motivated, and our motivations are complex, but then we can understand them based on his hierarchy. So then he's going to be looking at the similarity across cultures, that basically we all have the same needs. So he said we have basic needs, which is the pyramid shape that we talk about. So at the bottom, we have our physiological needs, and Maslow would say that if your physiological needs are not met, then you're not going to be able to even seek out other needs. But once your physiological needs are met, those are the most basic, the most important to you, then you move up to your safety needs. Now, this makes sense. Someone who does not feel safe in their environment is probably someone who's not going to be able to pursue other things. I mean, you can imagine someone who is maybe a very anxious person and they're living in a society, like maybe they're afraid of their parents hurting them, or they're afraid of war, or they don't feel safe, then they're not really able to focus on meeting their other needs. So if the physiological needs are met and the safety needs are met, then we go up to that love and belongingness needs, needing to have healthy, successful relationships with other people. And then beyond that, we have esteem needs, where we need to feel confident. We need to feel like we are someone of self-worth, that we are deserving of respect. And so then the top of that pyramid, the one that is hardest to reach, is self-actualization. So he had several ideas of self-actualization, basically meaning this is the best version of you. And he said, for example, you have to meet all of the other needs first. You have to have these B needs, these values like truth and justice and love, and these B values have to be there as well. You have to fully develop all of your abilities, and you have to be free from psychopathology. So he would say psychological illness is a barrier to self-actualization. So we also have aesthetic needs for love, and well, not love as much as like beauty and seeing the beautiful things in the world, basically. Cognitive needs, we need to be curious, we need to have knowledge, we need to be taught, we need to explore our environment and learn more. Neurotic needs had to do with negative things here. So if we're thinking about neurotic needs, like for an example, maybe we have a neurotic need to dominate other people, and that's not a healthy need, obviously. but that's going to cause us harm even if we don't hurt other people. The very fact that we want to and we need to is going to hurt us. So we're going to have to face our neurotic needs and deal with those to be able to become self-actualized. So take a look at that. He had this idea of the Jonah complex, that we are afraid of being our best self, and so sometimes we handicap ourselves, or we try to have this false humility, this humble, I could never do that, and it's all because we're afraid of trying for self-actualization and failing. And so then the goals of therapy here, this is going to be basically, we're going to have to help people become self-actualized if possible. So whatever the barriers are to that, maybe they're too dependent on other people, maybe they're not comfortable with themselves, they feel like they can't be alone, whatever the case may be, try to help them reach self-actualization. And then we talked about Rogers, and Rogers talked about self-actualization as well. He said that we all have a tendency to become self-actualized, but we don't all get there because we have these barriers to psychological health. So maybe we feel like who we are is not lining up with our experience, and that's going to cause incongruence. Or maybe because of that incongruence, we've started lying to ourselves. We've started distorting things. So that's going to hurt us as well. Or maybe the people in our lives don't show us the love and respect that we deserve, and so that's also a problem. But he would say typically people are good people. People want to grow. Sometimes we have things get in the way of that, so therapy is going to have to help. Your self-concept is who you truly are at the moment. Your ideal self is who you want to be. The best situation is to have these two be close to each other. If they're very far apart, then that's going to cause issues. So the conditions that we are required, the necessary and sufficient conditions, the therapist has to be congruent, so the therapist has to have taken care of their own business. And then we also need to have empathetic listening, so feeling what the other person is feeling, as well as that unconditional positive regard, love and respect for someone because they're a human being and because they deserve it. The person of tomorrow is that idea of the fully functioning, psychologically healthy individual. So you can take a look at the criteria for that. All this is going to start sounding similar to this idea of self-actualization. So he did this Chicago study to try to research. Remember that he came up with his therapy first and then built his theory off of it and wanted to make sure his therapy was working. And we saw that clients did feel like they were closer to their ideal selves after receiving therapy, that they did have better relationships with other people, but they still were not at the same level of psychological health as others. So maybe there was something else we could do there as well. Okay, so this has just been a very brief review of the material for Exam 2. Please feel free to let me know if you have any questions, and I will talk to you guys next week.